Was Jesus Christ based on a Greek god of madness? Was he buried in a small hamlet in rural Japan? Were there really 11 commandments instead of 10? And did Pope John Paul II have an affair with a Polish philosopher? These are the questions I'm going to be answering in today's video. The evil Pope. It's difficult to choose which evil pope I want to tell you about today. There have been so many horrible popes throughout the history of the Vatican that I could spend hours telling you about them. But today I'll focus on one, Pope Boniface VIII, the pope who was so evil, people thought he worshipped the devil. He was born under the name Benedetto Caetani in the year 1235. He didn't come to sit on the throne of the Vatican until 1294. Boniface was directly related to several earlier popes, so he earned his position through nepotism. Like many of the other popes of the Middle Ages, he was more concerned with status and wealth than religious matters. Pope Boniface VIII was all about securing his family's future by making sure they all had important positions. Pope Boniface was the very last of the great Vatican emperors. What I mean is that he was the last one to truly flex his muscles as a religious dictator in the church. But did he really worship Satan openly, or even in secret for that matter? It really depends on how you interpret worshipping the devil. Dante Alighieri, the author of Dante's Inferno, wrote that Boniface VIII was such a disastrous pope that his seat on the papal throne was an offense to heaven, an offense that condemned all of humanity to chaos. Dante really believed that just by being pope, Boniface was plunging society into the fires of hell. Let me take you through the horrible things Boniface did, starting with his first act as the official pontiff. Right away, he imprisoned his predecessor in a cell and left him there to rot until he died at the age of 81. The first thing he did as the right hand of God was imprison the old pope in a box to suffer. That isn't exactly a very pope-like thing to do. Boniface involved himself in just about every affair in Europe. He spent his days butting his nose into every little thing he could, constantly forcing himself in situations. It was his way of pushing papal supremacy. He believed every living creature needed to submit to his rule. He truly wanted to be emperor of the world and wanted the church to become more powerful than kings. He wasted church money on buying his family property and holdings. He declared a crusade in 1297, though it was not a religious crusade. This one was to take more territory. He was acting more like a Roman emperor than a pope. But it was this same greed that would see him defeated. He was making moves to lay France under his power, which King Philippe was not super happy about. Before the Pope could do any more damage, the king captured him and threw him in jail. A month later, in October 1303, Boniface was found dead. And now for number 6. But first, it's shout-out time. I wanted to give a big thank you to Sam Rolk 8097 and Deborah Lerman 5957 for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like this. The Shapiro Scroll. The Shapiro Scroll was labeled a forgery almost as soon as it was discovered. But was this ancient manuscript a biblical forgery? Or was the church too afraid to admit its legitimacy? For over 100 years, the scroll has been a source of serious controversy. The issue is that it adds an additional line to the 10 commandments, technically making them the 11 commandments. The discovery of the scroll came in the late 1800s. A man by the name of Moses Wilhelm Shapiro gained possession of the scroll through some mysterious circumstances. It was brought to him in pieces by a Sheikh Bedouin, who himself claimed the scroll was discovered by Arabs who were hiding in a cave near the Dead Sea. In the back of the cave, the Arabs discovered several bundles wrapped in ancient linen. Inside the bundles were black fragments, which when put together made up the Shapiro Scroll. The Arabs who found the fragments didn't know what to do with them, but understood they were important. This was how they ended up in the possession of Moses. Moses was a renowned archaeologist who had already been in a bit of trouble. He had discovered some ancient Moabite artifacts earlier, but was denounced as a fraud by Constantine Schlottmann, another academic. The accusation turned out to be wrong, and Shapiro's artifacts were confirmed as real, but it had left a stain on his reputation. In 1878, when Shapiro first showed off the scroll from the Dead Sea, once again he was called a fraud. It's about time I told you what the scroll said. In total, the scroll consisted of 15 leather strips. The strips were covered in faint Hebrew writing. There were lines from Deuteronomy, which were similar enough to other versions not to be totally unbelievable. It was the addition of the 11th commandment that really made scholars freak out. The new line read, "You shall not hate your brother in your heart. I am God, your God." The other 10 commandments were all the same as normal. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, all the classics. But this version also forbade hating your brother in your heart. On the surface, it seems like a pretty good commandment not to hate your siblings. Moses Shapiro was chased out of everywhere he tried to make the scrolls known. He presented them to scientists in Germany, and they called him a liar and a forger. Then he took the scroll to London, where experts at the British Museum also called it a forgery. He was driven to despair and fled, leaving behind the manuscript. 6 months later, he was discovered dead at his hotel in Rotterdam. One of the last things he wrote was a letter to one of the scientists who called him a liar. The letter said something along the lines of, "You have made a fool of me. I shall not be able to survive this shame." The manuscript is not a forgery. Then he was dead, and suddenly the manuscript disappeared. Nobody knows where it is, or if the church had something to do with driving Moses to his death. Jesus in Japan. How shocked would you be to learn that Jesus Christ was buried in a small town in northern Japan? I think most people would be flabbergasted to learn of the possibility. So prepare to be flabbergasted. Every year, about 20,000 pilgrims visit the small town of Shingo to visit the grave of Jesus Christ. The local legend is that after all the chaos of Israel, Jesus escaped to live a peaceful life. He traveled far into the east, where he landed in Japan and settled down to be a garlic farmer. He fell in love with a local woman called Miyuko. They had 3 children, and Jesus died at the age of 106. Outside the little farming village, he was buried in a mountain tomb. The name on the tomb isn't Jesus of Nazareth, it's Daitenku Taro Jurai. Whether this is true or not, it's all a matter of interpretation. There isn't any proof, only legends. The story says that Jesus Christ studied in Japan during the years missing from the Bible. Narrowly escaping death in Israel, Japan seemed like the natural place to return to for peace and quiet. Do you think any part of this story could be true? St. Thomas. Thomas the Apostle was not the most popular of Jesus Christ's 12 disciples. He might even be considered the least popular apostle. His nickname, Doubting Thomas, has remained a popular thing to call someone who doesn't believe in something for centuries. He earned the nickname when he refused to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Not much is mentioned about Thomas in the Gospels. He only speaks in one of them, and very rarely. However, some scholars think Thomas may have been the most important apostle of them all. Thomas may have been a second Jesus. The one thing the Gospels say about Thomas a lot is that he is somebody's twin. In fact, the original language of the Gospels names Thomas as Didymus, which is a word that literally translates to twin. When reading the original Bible, Thomas's name is twin, and he's also called a twin. Clearly, he looked a lot like someone. But who? The rest of the important information comes from the extra-canonical book, The Acts of Thomas. The ancient text has one passage in which Thomas and Jesus attend the same wedding. The groom mistakes Jesus for Thomas because the pair looked identical. In another forbidden biblical text called the Book of Thomas the Contender, Thomas is downright labeled Jesus' twin. In this book, Jesus chooses Thomas as his heir and passes on his divine and mystic knowledge of the universe. Could it be that Jesus had a twin brother? Jesus, the god of wine? The original Jesus Christ was a pagan god. The biblical account of Jesus is a work of fiction in which the character Jesus is based on a much older and much drunker deity. At least that's according to some scholars. Scholars like Timothy Freak, who co-authored several books on the subject. Timothy and his colleagues wrote that Jesus Christ was a direct copy of Dionysus, the god of wine, ritual madness, ecstasy, cultivation, and fertility. Of course, scholars have connected the story of Jesus to the story of many gods. It's been suggested Jesus was a copy of Osiris from ancient Egypt. Jesus' origin story is shockingly similar to the story of Adonis and Attis, and even the mystery deity Mithras. Pieces of the Jesus story can be found in many tales from the pagan world before Christianity. But is it true, and what is the evidence? Supporters of the theory claim Dionysius was born of a virgin and that he rose from the dead. Yes, just like Jesus Christ. But one of the biggest links is wine. Jesus turned water into wine, and Dionysius was the god of wine. Religious scholars will deny any similarities between Jesus and Dionysus, until they run out of breath. The Vatican will never admit that Jesus Christ was based on a pagan myth, but the evidence is there to suggest it. What do you think? The secret romance. Evidence has come to light that Pope John Paul II was involved in a secret forbidden romance with a married woman. According to new documents that have shocked the world, the pontiff fell in love with a Polish-American woman. The two of them exchanged what can only be described as smut letters for years. Her name was Anna Teresa Tymieniecka. The pair first met in the 1970s, just before Cardinal Karol Wojtyla was pope. They were both in their 50s already, involved in a philosophical study together. They must have hit it off pretty well, because even after Anna Teresa married in 1995, she remained close to Karol. They remained friends as he became pope in 1978, and continued to be friends up until John Paul's death in 2005. Anna herself passed on in 2014. There were already rumors about Pope John Paul breaching his vow of celibacy. These rumors had been around in the 2000s, but the Vatican denied them. A spokesperson for the Vatican said John Paul maintained his celibacy to the very end. Anna also denied that the pair had a romantic relationship before her death, but the new correspondence paints them both as potential liars. The letters show that for 32 years, the Pope had a secret relationship with the Polish philosopher. It's true that the letters don't indicate explicitly that the two had a physical relationship, at least not the letters that were revealed. But John Paul and Anna were most certainly cuckoo for one another. The Pope wrote in his letters that he was struggling with their relationship. He said he believed that Anna was a gift to him from God. He even made up an excuse for the way he was behaving. One of his letters says something along the lines of, "If I did not believe you were a gift from God, then I would never dare act like this." It almost seems as if he was saying God gave him permission to disregard his vows as the ruler of the Vatican. The steamy letters are at the National Library of Poland under lock and key. These letters are not on display to the public. It was the BBC who got a hold of them and made the information in them public. But the BBC weren't given all of them. They only saw some of the letters written by the former pope. They didn't get any of the letters written by Anna. There are still holes in the story. These holes could be important because John Paul II is a saint now, and he might have given in to temptation. Horror in Northern Ireland. In March of 1957, Kathleen Chambers had a traumatic experience giving birth to her stillborn baby. As she lay in a hospital recovering from the horrors of what she had just experienced, her husband Jim was taking their son to be buried. He arrived at the bog at the bottom of Milltown Cemetery. The bog was not technically in the cemetery, but at the edge of it away from the official graves. The gravedigger took the box from Jim's hand, the box containing the stillborn child. Then the gravedigger threw the box into a pit and shoveled some mud on it. Years later, when Kathleen tried to find the grave, it was impossible. The stillborn child was lost in the swamp. This is a story of scandal and the Roman Catholic Church in Northern Ireland. Kathleen's stillborn baby was one of thousands that were buried in mass graves at the bottom of Milltown Cemetery. Many of the children perished because of complications. Others died in the mother and baby homes Ireland is now notorious for. These were homes where unmarried women who got pregnant could be stashed in secret to avoid scandal. Then, when they gave birth, their babies were buried in the bog. This was happening from the beginning of the 20th century until around the 1990s. And yes, it was all because of the Roman Catholic Church. In the early part of the 20th century, you couldn't find a much more strictly religious place in the whole of Europe than Ireland. Because the Catholic Church held the belief that an unbaptized child couldn't be buried on consecrated grounds, people with stillborn children were left burying their babies in bogs. And so were women who had unwanted pregnancies and could not have their babies baptized. Nobody knows how many of these unmarked graves are in Northern Ireland. The Republic of Ireland has been doing their best to reconcile their hideous past, but things have been slower in Northern Ireland. Forensic archaeologist Tony Maguire has already identified around 100 sites where the church may have demanded babies be buried in unmarked plots. This was as recently as 30 years ago. Who do you think was the worst pope in the history of the Catholic Church? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and thanks a lot for watching. Remember to subscribe if you haven't yet, and come back soon for more awesome videos from the channel.